Welcome back, everybody, to Project Debrief.
Yes.
And this is our 5th episode.
It is.
Today, we are going to do a deep dive into a moment in American history that I know had all of us glued to the news.
For sure.
And that was Trump's first impeachment.
Yeah, and it's that first that makes this so significant. Not only was Trump just the third U.S. president to face impeachment, but it marked the first time that a president faced that challenge without support from his own party.
Yeah, it was a sign of the times, for sure. And this was just the beginning.
This was just the beginning. Exactly. The fact that this was just the first of 2 impeachments that he faced speaks volumes about just the kind of political landscape that we were in.
Yeah, so let's rewind a little bit for those maybe who don't remember all the details. When did these calls for Trump's impeachment first start to pop up?
Well, believe it or not, they started pretty early in his presidency. Back in 2017, Representatives Al Green and Brad Sherman were already voicing concerns and formally calling for impeachment proceedings.
But back then, it seemed more symbolic than anything else. What really shifted gears towards a formal impeachment inquiry?
I think the 2018 midterm elections were a turning point. Democrats gained control of the House of Representatives, and that gave them the power to launch investigations into Trump's actions.
Yeah, I remember it felt like every day there was a new headline.
It did.
About potential obstruction of justice or, Trump's business dealings or
Right.
It was just a lot to keep up with.
It was a whirlwind for sure, and it eventually led Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who had initially been a little bit hesitant about impeachment, to publicly acknowledge the need for an inquiry.
Okay, so let's talk about the heart of the matter here. The Trump-Ukraine scandal. What exactly was at the core of this controversy?
So at the core of it all was Trump allegedly pressuring Ukraine to investigate his political rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden, who had business dealings in that country.
And wasn't Rudy Giuliani, Trump's personal lawyer, heavily involved in all of this too? It felt like he was just adding fuel to the fire with his very public statements.
Absolutely. Giuliani was acting almost as an unofficial diplomat, working outside traditional channels to exert pressure on Ukraine. His involvement added another layer of intrigue and controversy to this already complex situation.
And then there was the mystery surrounding the $400 million military aid package to Ukraine.
Right.
That was suddenly put on hold.
Right.
Do we know if that was directly linked to this pressure campaign?
That frozen aid package became a central point of contention. Many argue that it was a blatant quid pro quo. You investigate my political rivals and you get the aid.
So this wasn't just some, typical political squabble.
Yeah.
It raised some serious concerns about abuse of power and potential foreign interference in the upcoming 2020 election.
Exactly. The scandal went beyond U.S. borders, involved, delicate international relations. It was a pivotal moment for Trump's presidency, with consequences reaching far beyond domestic politics.
And this all eventually led to the launch of the official impeachment inquiry. Can you walk us through that timeline?
Yeah, so the formal inquiry began in September 2019 when Speaker Pelosi announced it, accusing Trump of betraying his oath of office and jeopardizing national security.
I remember the sheer scale of the investigation was pretty impressive. There were 6 House committees involved.
I was.
They were subpoenaing documents, conducting closed-door depositions. It must have been a logistical nightmare.
It was a massive undertaking, reflecting just the seriousness of the allegations. But the White House wasn't exactly cooperating, were they?
No, they weren't. They claimed executive privilege, refused to comply with subpoenas, blocked key administration officials from testifying.
Right.
It felt like this constant battle between the executive and legislative branches.
It was a clash of powers. And in the midst of all of this, several key witnesses emerged whose testimonies became crucial to the investigation.
Were there any in particular that stood out to you as really impactful?
Well, Ambassador William Taylor's testimony was a big one. He was the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, and he painted a pretty damning picture of the pressure campaign. Fiona Hill, a former White House official, also provided some explosive details, describing what she called a shadow foreign policy being run by Giuliani.
And I remember Laura Cooper from the Defense Department also played a really crucial role.
Yes, her testimony shed light on just the confusion and concern surrounding the hold on the military aid. She revealed that she and other officials were completely blindsided by it, especially since it contradicted U.S. policy goals of supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression.
It really added to this growing sense that something was deeply wrong.
Yes.
And then, of course, came the public hearings.
The public hearing.
Which brought this whole impeachment saga into America's living rooms. It was political theater at its finest.
It was.
Were there any moments that were particularly memorable for you?
Yeah, I think Marie Yovanovitch's testimony was particularly compelling. As the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, she had been abruptly removed from her post earlier that year, and her testimony raised serious questions about whether her removal was politically motivated and tied to this pressure campaign on Ukraine.
Yeah, it felt like a real David and Goliath situation.
It did. And then there was Fiona Hill's powerful testimony where she directly confronted this fictional narrative that Ukraine had interfered in the 2016 election. This theory, heavily pushed by Russia and embraced by Trump, had become central to his defense.
It was a bold move on her part to challenge that narrative,
It was.
especially in such a public setting.
It was.
And then, of course, we can't forget Gordon Sondland. His testimony was a real bombshell.
It was probably the most explosive of all.
Hmm.
As the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, Sondland directly linked Trump to the pressure campaign, stating that he was acting under Trump's express direction when he worked with Giuliani to pressure Ukraine.
Yeah, he confirmed that a White House meeting for Zelensky was contingent on Ukraine announcing those investigations into the Bidens.
Right.
It was a real smoking gun moment for a lot of people.
It felt like things were coming to a head, and it was clear that the House was moving towards impeachment. It was only a matter of time.
So what happened next? Did the Intelligence Committee wrap up their investigation at that point?
They did. In early December 2019, the House Intelligence Committee issued a final report summarizing their findings.
And what was their conclusion?
Their report stated that President Trump had indeed solicited foreign interference in the 2020 election for his own personal political gain. They concluded that he had abused his power by pressuring Ukraine to investigate his rivals while simultaneously withholding military aid and a White House meeting.
I imagine the Republicans had a different take on those findings.
Oh, of course. As you might expect, the Republicans on the committees involved issued their own counter-report. They argued that there was no evidence to support the accusations against Trump and claimed the whole thing was a politically motivated witch hunt designed to overturn the 2016 election results.
So it really was a stark illustration of the partisan divide
It was.
that was gripping the nation at the time.
Absolutely. It set the stage for what would become, a highly charged battle, and it was clear that this impeachment process was about to move into a whole new arena. The next step was for the House Judiciary Committee to draft the articles of impeachment, and things were about to get a lot more legal and constitutional.
Okay, I'm ready to hear more about those articles of impeachment and how they ultimately led to that historic vote. But I think we need to pause here and let our listeners absorb everything we've covered so far.
Agreed. This is a lot to take in, and we've only just scratched the surface. Stay tuned because we'll be back soon to delve even deeper into the Trump impeachment saga.
See you soon.
Okay. All right.
Bye. So before the break, we were talking about how those House committees were really digging into the Trump-Ukraine situation.
Yeah.
And it felt like the whole country was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next.
Yeah, you could really feel the tension building. After the Intelligence Committee wrapped up its investigation and issued that report, the process moved to the House Judiciary Committee.
Okay.
And their job was to take all that evidence and actually draft the formal articles of impeachment.
And that's where things got really serious.
Yeah.
We were moving from a fact-finding mission into actual legal and constitutional territory.
Exactly. The question became, did Trump's actions as outlined by the Intelligence Committee meet the constitutional criteria for impeachment, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors?
Right. Those are some pretty weighty words.
They are.
So what were the specific charges that were ultimately brought against Trump?
Well, the House Judiciary Committee ultimately approved 2 articles of impeachment.
Okay.
The first, abuse of power, was directly related to the Trump-Ukraine scandal.
Okay. And that seemed pretty straightforward. They were basically saying that Trump used the power of the presidency for his own personal political gain.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. The article accused him of leveraging his office to pressure Ukraine to investigate his rivals while withholding military aid and a White House meeting as bargaining chips.
And what about the second article? What was that all about?
The second article was obstruction of Congress, and that focused on Trump's persistent refusal to cooperate with the investigation.
It felt like every time those House committees tried to get information or testimony, they just hit a wall.
Right.
Was that the main point of the obstruction charge?
Precisely. The article accused Trump of basically stonewalling the entire impeachment inquiry by blocking witnesses, refusing to comply with subpoenas, and basically just throwing up roadblocks at every turn.
So with these 2 articles of impeachment approved, what happened next?
Well, it all led to a historic vote on December 18, 2019. The House of Representatives voted to impeach President Trump, making him only the 3rd president in U.S. history to face such a decision.
I remember that day vividly.
Yeah.
The energy in that House chamber was electric.
It was a moment for the history books. And while the outcome of the vote was pretty much a foregone conclusion, the fact that it happened at all was significant.
Yeah, the country was so deeply divided
It was.
along partisan lines, and that division was really reflected in the vote itself.
Almost every Democrat voted in favor of impeachment while every Republican voted against it. It was a stark reminder of just how polarized American politics had become.
There were a couple of Democrats who broke ranks and voted against at least one of the articles, and then there was Justin Amash, who was an independent at the time, who voted with the Democrats. But yeah, for the most part, it was a straight party line vote.
Right. But even beyond the political maneuvering and partisan battles, there were some really interesting reactions to the impeachment from kind of unexpected corners. Do you remember the editorial published by Christianity Today?
Oh, yes, that was
Yeah.
surprising.
Yeah.
For a prominent evangelical magazine to call for Trump's removal from office was a pretty big deal.
It was, they argued that Trump had betrayed his oath of office and that his actions were profoundly immoral. This wasn't coming from the usual liberal critics. This was a voice from within Trump's own evangelical base expressing deep concern.
It really highlighted the moral and ethical questions
Yes.
at the heart of this whole impeachment debate. It wasn't just about politics. It was about character and leadership.
Exactly. And then there was that whole ad campaign launched by the group Republicans for the rule of law.
Oh, right. They were urging senators to call for witnesses during the Senate trial. Weren't they spearheaded by Bill Kristol, a well-known conservative figure?
Yes. It was a notable effort to try and pressure Republican senators to conduct a thorough and impartial trial, even though at that point it was pretty clear that most Republicans were solidly in Trump's camp.
Yeah, it felt like everyone was bracing themselves for the next act of this drama,
Right.
the Senate trial.
The Senate trial.
It was a roller coaster.
It was. So the impeachment process now moved to the Senate, where they would hold a trial to determine whether to remove Trump from office. And right from the start, it was clear that this wasn't going to be a smooth process. Partisan tensions were already running incredibly high.
Yeah, I remember Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell made it very clear that he was not going to be an impartial juror. Didn't he say something like he intended to coordinate his strategy with the White House?
He did, and that caused a lot of controversy because traditionally senators are supposed to take an oath to be impartial during an impeachment trial.
Right.
But McConnell basically argued that impeachment was inherently a political process, not a legal one.
Uh-huh.
So impartiality wasn't really required.
That didn't go over well with the Democrats.
Not at all. They countered that the Senate still had a constitutional duty to conduct a fair and impartial trial regardless of political affiliations. But their arguments fell on deaf ears. The battle lines were drawn and the stage was set for a highly partisan showdown.
So who are the key players we should be paying attention to during this Senate trial?
Well, on the Republican side, you had Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, who was orchestrating the strategy for the defense. On the Democratic side, you had Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who was pushing for a more thorough trial with witnesses and additional evidence. And of course, presiding over all was Chief Justice John Roberts, as mandated by the Constitution.
It felt like Adam Schiff was a constant presence on TV during that time.
Yeah.
What exactly was his role in the Senate trial?
He was the lead House impeachment manager. So essentially, he served as the prosecutor presenting the case against Trump to the Senate. He was joined by several other House Democrats who also acted as impeachment managers.
And what about Trump's defense team?
Well, Trump assembled a pretty impressive team of legal heavyweights. Leading the charge were White House counsel Pat Cipollone and Jay Sekulow, who had also represented Trump during the Russia investigation.
I remember there were a lot of big names involved. Wasn't Ellen Dershowitz, the famous Harvard law professor, part of the defense team?
You've got a good memory. He was. And so was Kenneth Starr, who you might remember as the independent counsel who led the investigation into Bill Clinton.
Wow, they really brought out the big guns.
He did.
With all of those legal minds involved, it must have been a pretty intense legal battle.
It was. And one of the most controversial moments of the trial came when the Senate voted against allowing new witnesses or documents to be subpoenaed.
Wait, so they basically just relied on the evidence that the House had already gathered? No new information or testimonies?
Essentially, the Democrats fought hard to call witnesses, particularly John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor, who was rumored to have firsthand knowledge of the events surrounding the Ukraine pressure campaign.
That seems like a pretty big omission. Why wouldn't they want to hear from someone like Bolton?
Well, the Republicans argued that it was the House's responsibility to have gathered all the necessary evidence during their inquiry.
Right.
They insisted it wasn't the Senate's job to do the House's work for them.
It felt like a real missed opportunity to get to the bottom of things.
It did for many.
So without any new witnesses or evidence, how did those arguments play out during the trial itself?
Well, the Democrats really focused their arguments on Trump's alleged abuse of power. They laid out the evidence showing that he had used the power of his office to pressure Ukraine for personal political gain, arguing that this was a clear violation of his oath of office and a betrayal of the public trust.
And how did Trump's defense team counter those arguments?
They maintained that there was no direct evidence proving any wrongdoing by Trump. They pointed to the lack of an explicit quid pro quo in the transcript of Trump's call with Zelensky and argued that much of the evidence against Trump was based on hearsay and assumptions.
So it sounds like they were trying to create enough reasonable doubt to sway some senators. Did it work?
Well, with the Republican-controlled Senate that seemed largely determined to acquit Trump, the outcome wasn't exactly a surprise. But there was one twist that no one saw coming.
Oh, plot twist. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So the final vote took place on February 5, 2020. And as expected, the Senate acquitted President Trump on both charges. However, it wasn't a completely party-line vote.
Really? Who broke ranks?
Senator Mitt Romney, a Republican from Utah, went against his party and voted guilty on the first charge of abuse of power.
Wow, I completely forgot about that. That was a huge deal at the time.
It was. He became the first senator in U.S. history to vote to convict a president from his own party. In a powerful speech explaining his vote, Romney argued that Trump's actions were a clear abuse of power and that he had a moral obligation to uphold his oath to the Constitution, even if it meant going against his party.
That was a really brave stance to take, especially given the political climate at the time. I imagine he faced a lot of backlash from his fellow Republicans.
He did. But he stood by his decision, and it really underscored the gravity of the accusations against Trump, even though it wasn't enough to change the outcome of the trial.
So Trump was acquitted. Case closed. End of story.
Not quite. Even though the impeachment drama had reached its climax, the story didn't end there.
Okay, so we've walked through this whole impeachment saga. The investigations, the testimonies, the arguments, and the vote. It's a lot to process.
It is, and even though the Senate acquitted Trump, it didn't mean everything just went back to normal.
Right. It felt like the whole country was reeling from this experience, and there were definitely some aftershocks.
Oh, Trump didn't exactly take the high road after the acquittal. In fact, he retaliated against some of the people who had testified against him.
That doesn't sound very presidential.
It wasn't. He fired several officials who had spoken out against him during the inquiry, including Ambassador Sondland and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who had served on the National Security Council.
Wow, talk about holding a grudge. It felt like he was trying to send a message to anyone who might dare to cross him in the future.
Yeah, many saw it as an attempt to intimidate potential whistleblowers and critics. It raised serious concerns about his respect for the rule of law and his willingness to use the power of his office for personal vendettas.
Yeah, it definitely didn't help his image. It seemed to confirm what many of his critics have been saying all along, that he was more concerned with protecting himself than serving the country.
And it added fuel to the already raging fire of partisan division. The impeachment had exposed these deep cracks in American society, and the aftermath only seemed to widen those cracks.
It's amazing how this one event continues to resonate even years later. It feels like it marked a turning point in American politics, a shift towards even greater polarization and distrust.
I think you're right. It's hard to overstate the impact of Trump's first impeachment. It became a defining moment of his presidency, and it really set the stage for the political battles that would continue to unfold in the years that followed.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways we should keep in mind when we think about the Trump impeachment and its legacy?
Well, one important lesson is the crucial role of checks and balances in our democracy. The fact that the House was able to investigate and impeach Trump, even though he was ultimately acquitted by the Senate, is a testament to the strength of our system.
Yeah, it's a reminder that no one, not even the president, is above the law.
Exactly. And it also highlights the importance of an informed and engaged citizenry. Public opinion matters, and the way people interpret and respond to events like impeachment can have a profound impact on the course of history.
You know, it's interesting thinking back to that time. It felt like everyone had an opinion on the impeachment, and those opinions were often very deeply entrenched.
Oh, it was a very polarizing event. It forced people to confront their values, their beliefs about the presidency, and their vision for the country.
And it seems like those divisions haven't really gone away. They've only become more pronounced in the years since.
It's true. The impeachment was a symptom of these larger trends that were already underway. Hyper-partisanship, the erosion of trust in institutions, the rise of social media as a powerful force in shaping public opinion.
It's almost like the impeachment acted as a catalyst, accelerating those trends and pushing us further down a path of division and distrust.
It's a sobering thought, but it's important to acknowledge these challenges if we want to find a way forward. As we grapple with the legacy of Trump's presidency and the political landscape we find ourselves in today, it's crucial to remember the lessons of the impeachment.
So what does this all mean for us, the everyday citizens trying to make sense of it all?
Yeah.
What can we learn from this experience?
I think it underscores the importance of civic responsibility in an age of information overload. We can't just passively consume news anymore. We have to be critical thinkers. We have to seek out multiple perspectives, and we have to engage in thoughtful and respectful dialogue, even when it's uncomfortable.
It's a call to action to be more informed, more engaged citizens. Because the issues raised by Trump's impeachment haven't gone away. They're still with us, and they'll continue to shape American politics for years to come.
Absolutely. And while we've covered a lot of ground today, I think there's still so much more to ponder.
Yeah, I agree. This is one of those topics that you could spend hours discussing and still only scratch the surface. It's a reminder that history is complex and there are always multiple perspectives to consider.
Exactly. And it's up to each of us to engage with these complex issues critically and thoughtfully, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. It's not about having all the answers, but about keeping the conversation going, asking the tough questions, and striving to understand this pivotal moment in our history.
And who knows, maybe by the time we revisit this topic, we'll have even more insights to share. But for now, I think we've given our listeners plenty to chew on.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep those brains buzzing. And if you have any thoughts on Trump's first impeachment or its lasting impact, we'd love to hear from you. You can find us on social media or drop us an email. We're always eager to hear from our listeners. This is Project Debrief, signing off for now.